Welcome to a good podcast. I'm James, the host. I'm joined by
Oliver, Louis,
and Reese.
Today we're going to be talking about superhero and spy movies and the action genre as a whole. We've got a few questions to start with.
So the first question we're starting off with is, what is an action film, and what are the problems of defining an action film?
Well, to start, it's a very broad genre as a whole. Like, you can pretty much call any film action if it contains some kind of fight scene. Like, you could say Scream is an action movie because there's a lot of action in it, but it doesn't mean it is an action movie.
It is one of the most common genres, as any film with, like James was saying, action in it can be defined as one. So over 50% of films usually can be classed, at least as a subgenre, as action.
Yeah, I mean, there's like different types of action films you can get because there's subgenres like superhero actions and things like that. But there's also like hybrids, which is like sci-fi action. So
You could even define those as like
Their
genres
own
in
thing,
themselves. Like
yeah.
Star Wars is like one of the biggest movies of all time, but I'd still say that's its own genre anyway, because it's like a sci-fi action.
yeah,
What would you say, Reese?
I agree. Most films contain some form of action.
I'd say the main definition of him, I'd say, is just like general fights, explosions. Like, I'd say, in my opinion, I'd say an action film is mostly superheroes.
Yeah, I think
That's like the most
that's
common.
what it is nowadays. I think
Yeah.
a lot of the time you have like the core like main character, and them not discovering themselves, but like going through some kind of change throughout the mission, or like
Yeah.
changing as a person throughout the film. Like every movie.
So the second question is, what are the typical symbolic codes and conventions of an action film, and what are like examples of that? So the symbolic codes and conventions is the
Stuff
character.
that isn't like
There's loads really.
cinematography,
It's-
something.
No,
What's conventional of the genre, and what can be
the
entailed
symbolic
in it?
codes and conventions is the characters, the narrative, and the what was the third one?
Mise en scene.
Oh yeah, mise en scene. So
Isn't that more technical? So
Brazzers.
a lot of the what were we saying? A lot of the more. What's the question? What's the terminology they use?
the symbolic codes and
A
conventions.
lot of the more symbolic codes and conventions follow the characters more specifically, not necessarily like the surroundings or the setting they're in. Like, it would just take
What they're actually doing.
yeah,
in the
what they're
scene.
doing. They're not gonna go for like, I need to pick up my kids and I need to date my wife. No, it's more about what they're going through on the mission.
It'll be something out of the ordinary, you know. It might start off normal, like it'll be someone at home with the family, and then they'll have to go off and save the day, and then it picks up from there.
So is that about the narrative then?
That's more
So
about
that's
the
going
narrative.
into narrative. But
Do you have anything about like the characters or something?
So the characters, I think there's always obviously a good guy. There's always like a bad guy.
Yeah.
There's sometimes like a sidekick. I'd say there's quite a lot of the time like a not a sidekick, like a girlfriend type figure.
Like a femme fatale.
Yeah, like like Spider-Man, he has his
Mary Jane.
Yeah, Mary Jane. Like Iron Man, he has his.
Sorry, he's just waving it around in the room.
Iron Man has his girlfriend and stuff. They're always like kind of there to help, but also
they're a
like,
big
caring about-
influence on what the character does,
Yeah.
and they can change the whole course of the story. Really, it
Also,
depends how much they're
There's like, it's always in a very large populated area.
Yeah.
So there's always loads of like, say for an example, extras or just like public people.
There's always
Yeah,
someone
they're
the
often-
characters need to save. It's never
Yeah.
just like, oh, we're in this abandoned building, let's just beat the shit out of each other. It's always, okay, I've got to
In a
protect
really
these civilians,
populated area.
and I've got to stop this nuke, and I've got to make sure the Empire State Building doesn't melt or something like
Yeah,
that.
the
They're
villain,
always
yeah.
balancing something on top of the other. So it's
The bad guy doesn't want. He wants to create a scene, so he'll always lead the superhero to a big final battle, usually in a dense area. So even if the superhero started off in a small suburban town, they will change and end up in bloody
Like-
New York.
like that scene in have you seen The Amazing Spider-Man 2? There's a scene where they're in Times Square and they're just running up like a pair of stairs, but the stairs don't have an end, so they just run up to a pair of stairs. It gets electrocuted, and they're like, "Where do we go?" Back down the stairs. It's like. Anyway, my wife divorced me, so I'm going through that right now.
So we done what's in like the mise en scene. So it's usually located in. So the next question is, what are the typical technical codes and conventions of an action film? So that's like editing, audio, and cinematography. So if we start off with the cinematography.
Cinematography, I think for the most part, they try and keep it fairly grounded with like handheld shots and like little to no cuts. Like, if you want an action scene to be easily like easy to follow, you should try and keep it grounded. Like, don't go into the sky out for no reason.
Keep it fairly realistic.
Yeah.
Next up, we'll go on to audio. A Foley artist will be needed a lot in superhero films because there are a lot of noises that need to be emphasised. So if someone punches someone in the face, you get a big, typical classic punch sound effect, which in the real world isn't apparent, but in the film world is. And the same goes for many other sound effects. And there's also many other techniques in audio that needs to be changed, such as manipulated. Yeah. Like you might have a voice changer for a character with a mask. There was I can't remember the name of the film, but there was a film that came out about a year ago, and a character was wearing a mask, and they had to redo all his lines.
It's Bane.
Bane, was it
Bane?
Bane? Was that it? Yeah, that was it. Bane.
Dark Knight Rises.
Was that what we watched in the thing? Yeah, you couldn't actually hear his voice, so they had to re-record the audio over and add it over the mask because his voice was too muffled with the original recording.
And a lot of these like exaggerated sound effects and like voices.
Diegetic audio. There you go.
I'm gonna kill you.
No, I forgot the name of the thing.
A lot of the audio is exaggerated to create to show the almost unrealistic nature of the characters. Like, you wouldn't just have regular footsteps for a guy who's 100,000 pounds and can like throw someone through a window, you know? It's always to an extra degree of like insanity in a weird way.
Especially when you're in the cinema, when you've got massive speakers coming at you, you can really feel the bass and the sound effects rather than just a little swoosh if someone like slices someone with a knife or something like that.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of like explosions, like screams of like the public. I feel like there's a lot of like non-diegetic sounds because there's a lot of like scary music and added on sounds to make it very hyper exaggerated and tension. And then there's also editing. I feel like there's a lot of cuts, I'd say.
But I don't think that's
it
only...
depends, yeah.
It's only really when you notice it, is it when it's like necessarily bad. You can have like 100 cuts in like one movie. Obviously you'll have more than 100 cuts. You can have like 100 cuts in one scene, but if it flows properly or if it's like...
The last question is, what are the key differences between superhero and spy films, and what makes them different action films?
I think to start, a lot of the time, the plot and the plan of the main villain isn't necessarily something he wants public. Like, if he's going to steal all the money in all the bank systems, he doesn't want the general public to know about it. But in superhero movies, the villains are really like, they're almost like actors. They're always performing in front of an audience and trying to make a spectacle out of it. Like Dr. Octopus at the bank, or you have like Electro and Spider-Man 2 in Times Square with the stairs. It's that sort of thing that like elevates it to a different degree of tension in both cases. They're both equally action-packed, but I think for the most part you have more of a spectacle with superheroes.
Spy films, on the other hand, as well, will always be a more realistic type of violence. You won't have people throwing people around with tentacles coming out their back, or any other type of superpower like flying. A spy will usually be a normal guy or girl who is trying to hunt down someone and has been put on a mission, and they'll go on a long journey, but there will be realistic use of weapons. There may be a sci-fi aspect